Buenos días a todos.
Or is it the afternoon already?
O ya es la tarde.
Almost.
Ya es casi la tarde.
It's an honor for me to speak to you about the key messages in the IPCC. IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Fifth Assessment Report.
Es un gran placer para mí poder hablar con ustedes sobre el cambio climático y transmitirles los mensajes claves del quinto informe de evaluación del IPCC, que es el panel intergubernamental del cambio climático.
The IPCC was established a little more than 25 years ago to provide policymakers with the best quality information about the science of climate change in all its diversity.
La IPCC se fue establecida para suministrarle a los que elaboran las políticas una fuente objetiva de información acerca de las causas del cambio climático.
The three key questions the IPCC is trying to answer are the following. What is happening in the climate system, what are the risks, and what can be done?
Las tres preguntas claves que se está tratando de responder el IPCC es: ¿qué está pasando en el sistema climático? ¿Cuáles son los riesgos? ¿Y qué podemos hacer?
The last IPCC report was written over a 4-year period.
El último informe de IPCC se escribió por periodos de 4 años. Los últimos se fueron escribiendo cada 4 años.
And it's 5,000 pages long.
Y tiene 5,000 páginas.
So I would like to try to summarize in one slide the 4 key messages of that report.
Por lo tanto, voy a tratar de resumir en una sola diapositiva los 4 mensajes claves de este informe.
The first one is that the human influence on the climate system is now clear.
La primera es que no hay dudas ahora de la influencia humana sobre el sistema climático.
If the emission of greenhouse gases, which warm the climate, as Mauricio explained, continue,
si continúan la emisión de gases de invernadero que calientan la Tierra, como ya explicó Mauricio,
they would increase the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and in sometimes irreversible impacts for both people and ecosystems.
Aumentará la probabilidad de impactos severos, pervasivos e irreversibles tanto para las personas como para los ecosistemas.
And I would like to add that the volume of the IPCC that was dealing with impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation was co-chaired, the effort to write that volume was co-chaired by Professor Vicente Barros from Argentina, who played a very important role in IPCC.
Y dice que en este reporte de la evaluación, el quinto reporte, tuvieron la colaboración de Vicente Barros de la República Argentina, que trabajó muy bien y colaboró muchísimo.
The third key message from that IPCC report is that while climate change is a threat to sustainable development, there are many opportunities to integrate mitigation, we just heard about mitigation, adaptation, we also heard about adaptation, and also the pursuit of other societal objectives.
Mientras el cambio climático es una amenaza para el desarrollo sostenido, hay muchas oportunidades para integrar la mitigación, la adaptación y la búsqueda de otros objetivos sociales.
In summary, humanity has the means to limit climate change and also to build a more sustainable and resilient future.
En resumen, la humanidad tiene los medios para limitar el cambio climático y construir un futuro más sostenible y resiliente.
You have heard Mauricio speaking about the warming already, so I think I will skip this slide showing the increase in temperature.
Yo creo que como ya lo escucharon a Mauricio hablando del calentamiento global, me voy a saltear estas diapositivas.
You also know that sea level has increased by approximately 20 centimeters already.
Ustedes saben que ya el nivel del mar aumentó aproximadamente 20 centímetros.
You have also heard the description of the increase in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you know already that this concentration is now much higher than it has ever been for the last 800,000 years.
También escucharon acerca de las concentraciones atmosféricas del dióxido de carbono que han aumentado a niveles sin precedentes y esto ha pasado como mínimo nunca antes de 800.000 años atrás.
Now, we know now with a high level of certainty that this is because the increase in the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases such as methane, N2O, etc., that the warming takes place. Mauricio showed it another way, but this is the IPCC conclusions from the last report. It's extremely likely, and it means a probability, a certainty level higher than 95%, that the human influence has been the dominant cause explaining the warming over the past 50 years.
Como ya les explicó Mauricio, además del dióxido de carbono está el ácido nitroso, el metano y todas estas emisiones. El informe de la IPCC es que más del 95% de la responsabilidad tiene que ver con el comportamiento humano.
And what this diagram shows is the difference between climate simulations that are forced only with natural factors, and they are shown by the blue line, the bottom blue line.
Y acá vemos las diferencias entre las diferencias climáticas que se producen solamente por la naturaleza, y esto lo muestran las líneas azules,
and the red line, which, as you can see, follows much better the observed temperature,
y la línea roja, que como pueden ver, sigue mucho mejor la temperatura observada,
and the red line is obtained, is the result of climate simulations that are forced by the combination of natural factors and human factors.
Y la línea roja surge de simulaciones que se generan a partir de una combinación de los factores naturales y los factores humanos.
Now, why is the concentration of CO2 increasing so much in the atmosphere? This is now well understood, and I'd like to explain briefly the main reason.
¿Por qué aumentó tanto las concentraciones de dióxido de carbono en la atmósfera? Esto no está muy bien entendido y quisiera explicárselos un poquito mejor.
It is because human activities and human emissions of CO2, mostly coming from the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, and to a lesser extent coming from deforestation.
Esto es una combinación que surge por el acto humano, por que queman dióxido de carbono, metano.
No, here I'm only talking about CO2 here.
El dióxido de carbono, y hacen las emisiones al exterior.
And human emissions coming from the burning of coal, oil and gas.
Y las emisiones humanas que vienen de quemar carbón, petróleo y gas.
and to a lesser extent coming from deforestation,
y en menor escala de la deforestación.
are putting out of balance the carbon cycle which had been perfectly balanced for the last 10,000 years.
Desequilibrando el ciclo de carbono que durante los últimos 10.000 años había estado muy bien equilibrado.
We are now emitting approximately 2 times more than what natural systems, vegetation, the oceans and forests can absorb.
Nosotros ahora estamos emitiendo prácticamente el doble de lo que puede absorber la naturaleza, la vegetación, los océanos.
And it is because of this imbalance between what we emit and what natural systems can absorb that CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere.
Y debido a este desequilibrio entre lo que nosotros emitimos y lo que puede absorber la naturaleza, se producen las emisiones de dióxido de carbono a la atmósfera.
So understanding the carbon cycle is very important and is actually very important for policy making.
Entender realmente el ciclo del carbono es muy importante para las personas a cargo de la elaboración de políticas.
Because the CO2 will accumulate in the atmosphere and its concentration will increase in the atmosphere as long as we emit more than what nature can absorb.
Porque seguirán aumentando las emisiones de dióxido de carbono en tanto y en cuanto sigamos emitiendo más de lo que realmente puede absorber la naturaleza.
This means that historical emissions, coming mostly from developed countries, matter for a very long time in the climate system.
Esto quiere decir que las emisiones históricas que son producidas por los países desarrollados han sido un problema durante mucho tiempo.
This also means that the carbon space, the amount of carbon that can still be emitted if we want to limit the warming to less than 2 degrees is narrowing quickly.
Esto quiere decir que el espacio que nos queda para seguir emitiendo, si queremos que el calentamiento se mantenga en 2 grados centígrados, cada vez tenemos menos posibilidades de seguir emitiendo, se reduce el espacio.
The trend today at the global scale is shown by this curve, and it shows that the emission increase is mostly coming from the usage of fossil fuel.
Acá se muestra las emisiones antropogénicas globales y se muestra en el gráfico que la mayoría surge de los combustibles fósiles.
In terms of sectors at the world scale, the energy sector is the main source of greenhouse gases, but agriculture is number 2 in that hierarchy.
En la escala mundial, el sector energético es el que más emite, con un 35%, pero la agricultura está en el segundo lugar.
Now, if we want to look at the future of climate, we have to work with scenarios, and we use IPCC use those 4 main scenarios for the future concentration of CO2.
Para el escenario de emisiones, la IPCC utiliza 4, donde se muestran los 4 escenarios más importantes.
So these are, if I can correct my dear translator, these are not scenarios of emissions, these are scenarios of concentration.
Yeah,
it's not the same.
They told me that in Spanish, no, me dijeron que se decía no de concentraciones, sino de emisiones, un técnico. Si no es lo mismo, pido que me...
It's not at all the same.
Me dijeron afuera.
No,
emisión... the lady that I was talking to you said, you have to translate it like that.
Well, let me explain very simply.
Escenarios de concentraciones, perdón.
I have to explain very simply why this is so important. The concentration is what remains in the atmosphere.
Esto es muy importante porque la concentración es lo que queda en la atmósfera.
The emissions are what we emit, and as I explained, the carbon cycle is such that there is a big difference between what we emit and what stays in the atmosphere.
Claro. Y las emisiones son lo que nosotros emitimos. Entonces hay una gran diferencia entre lo que emitimos, como ya les expliqué, y lo que queda en la atmósfera.
So the concentration is, if you wish, the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Entonces, la concentración es el porcentaje de dióxido de carbono en la atmósfera.
So the red curve is the top scenario in our jargon. My apologies for that complicated name. It's called RCP 8.5. It's a kind of business as usual scenario.
La línea roja, y perdónenme porque la jerga nuestra, esa línea roja se llama RCP 8.5, es el escenario donde las actividades comerciales siguen de la misma manera.
And the bottom scenario, the blue line, shows a scenario where intense mitigation takes place, efforts to reduce emissions so that the concentration stays stable approximately at the present level.
Entonces la línea azul, la de más abajo, es donde se hacen grandes esfuerzos de mitigación para reducir las emisiones y entonces se mantiene prácticamente al nivel en el que estamos ahora.
When you feed those scenarios to climate models, you have very different results for the end of the century. For the lower scenario, you have a temperature warming of approximately 1 more degree Celsius, and for the red scenario, the business as usual scenario, you have approximately 5 degrees more.
Cuando nosotros rellenamos estas líneas, vemos que si se hacen los mayores esfuerzos, el calentamiento de la Tierra va a aumentar solamente 1 grado. Si sigue de la misma manera la actividad industrial y comercial, va a aumentar 5 grados el calentamiento.
Now, I'm told I have 2 minutes left, and
me dijeron que me quedan 2
at
minutos
least 20 minutes more to speak.
y necesitaría 20 minutos más.
So I have a big challenge here.
Es un gran desafío para mí.
Do you wish me to continue in this mode, which doubles the time taken, or can we continue in English for the last few minutes?
Tenemos 2 opciones. O no puedo seguir hablando más que 2 minutos, o puedo seguir solo en inglés, sin la traducción, y darles un poco más. Por favor.
English?
En inglés.
Yes. Thank you so much. Let's thank the translator because she did an excellent job, but it will be a little easier for me, and then it's easier for me to stay within the time that remains. So, and I will speak a little faster, but you also will have all those slides available, at least on my webpage, so you can have more time to look at them. So, average global temperature doesn't mean anything. Let's look at what it means for South America. In the top scenario, you see that the warming could reach, in some parts of South America, 5, 6, 7 degrees more by the end of the century in the worst case. It also means changes in precipitation, which is very important for agriculture, for example. Overall, it seems that in this part of South America, it would probably be an increase on the average by the end of the century. Sea level would, of course, also continue to increase with the difficulties for coastal regions. There would be coastal impacts which have been studied in detail in the report, and you can see that Buenos Aires, I cannot show you on this screen, but Buenos Aires is one of the red points that could be affected in terms of coastal infrastructure by the sea level increase. The number of extreme events is also changing, the number of hot days, the number of days with very intense precipitation, which is, of course, increasing the risk of floods. And just to give you an example, to show you that the IPCC speaks about Argentina, among other regions. This is a quotation from the last report saying that heavy precipitation events have been observed in results of modeling studies for Argentina. So there are impacts of climate change everywhere in the world, affecting all continents and all populations, but unfortunately there's a standard rule, which is that the poor are more affected than the rich. They are more vulnerable everywhere, as this picture taken 10 years ago in New Orleans shows. I mean, of course, this black handicapped person is more vulnerable to the same storm surge than other American living in the city, but who were able to escape the city. So food and water would be affected, poverty would be affected, migrations would be affected, coastal regions would be affected, and these are only a few examples. I will have to skip this, but the three key factors, the three key sectors where in South America there would be severe impacts for climate change are the water sector, the food and food security sector, and the vector-borne diseases, with some potential for adaptation, but there is a limit to adaptation. In those slides, which you will be able to read later if you're interested in the detail, there are some examples of adaptation measures for those three sectors. Unfortunately, I have to skip them. Of course, there is a relationship between the impacts and the emissions. But the relationship is actually a little more subtle than just the emissions. The relationship is with the accumulated emissions, the cumulative total since the beginning of the industrialization. So this diagram shows that the warming on the vertical scale is a function of the total emissions since the beginning of the large-scale emissions. This means that if humanity wants to stay below a given warming, there's a limited total amount of CO2 that can be emitted. And this is what we call the carbon budget. And this is the carbon budget for 2 degrees, with a probability of staying below 2 degrees higher than 2/3. But the problem is, as you can see, that we have used already 2/3 of that budget up to now. So only 1,000 gigatons remain, and since we emit approximately 40 gigatons every year, you see that there is urgency. There is urgency also because, as you can see here, the trends in emissions are going that way, while if we want to stay within that budget, they should, at a global scale, go the other way. There are many areas, many ways to reduce emissions. Energy efficiency is a very important area. Greater use of low carbon and no carbon, and in particular renewable energy sources. Improved carbon sinks is a very important area, and lifestyle and behavioral changes can also contribute. There is urgency, as I said, because the longer mitigation is delayed at the appropriate scale, at the global scale, the more CO2 will accumulate in the atmosphere and render the achievement of the objective of staying below 2-degree warming more difficult. And that's even more true for a lower target, like staying below 1.5 degrees. A key message of the IPCC report also is that there are ways to fight climate change and at the same time address other issues. Just one example is air quality, as shown here. There are ways to improve air quality while also fighting against climate change. The IPCC is very clear also about the importance of putting the efforts to fight climate change and to adapt to climate change in the context of sustainable development, taking equity considerations into account. It's clear that humanity today has a choice between the scenario, the lower scenario, RCP 2.6 on the left, where adaptation is still possible, and the other scenario, the warmer scenario. These are the temperature by the end of the century, for both scenarios, and in that latter scenario, adaptation would be much more difficult. Please participate as you can to the next IPCC report. There will be a call for nominations in approximately a year and a half from now to participate in the 6th assessment report, and I hope many Argentinian scientists will participate. And last but not least, I think in the future it's very important to think about the children. Thank you very much for your attention.